Here are 5 main factors that helped Chairman Mao Zedong rise to become the most evil dictator in the world. Mao Zedong remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern history. As the founder of the People's Republic of China, his vision of a socialist utopia reshaped the nation, but his methods and policies inflicted unimaginable suffering on millions. From his strategic rise through the Chinese Communist Party to his authoritarian rule marked by famine, purges, and widespread fear, Mao's legacy is both revolutionary and deeply tragic. Here are 5 critical events that not only propelled Mao to power as the chairman of China, but also established his reputation as one of the most ruthless and destructive dictators in world history. Part 1. Introduction. The Fragile Republic and Foreign Encroachments. The collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911 ushered in the Republic of China, initially led by Sun Yat-sen. But the dream of a united and modernized China quickly unraveled. Regional warlords divided the country into fiefdoms, competing for power. Meanwhile, foreign imperialist powers, the British, French, Japanese, and others, tightened their grip on China's ports, railways, and resources, creating a patchwork of foreign concessions and territories. The humiliation deepened after World War I. Although China had sent workers and soldiers to support the Allied powers, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 gave Japan the German-controlled Shandong Peninsula. This betrayal ignited the May 4th movement, a nationwide outpouring of anger, particularly among students, intellectuals, and urban workers. Calls for anti-imperialism, modernization, and radical reform spread like wildfire. Marxism reaches China. Amid this political and social chaos, new ideas took root. Western political ideologies like liberalism and democracy were debated alongside Chinese philosophies like Confucianism and anarchism. Marxism, with its promise to overthrow feudalism and imperialism, resonated deeply with Chinese intellectuals. Key figures like Li Dazhao, a librarian at Peking University, and Chen Duxiu, a fiery academic and editor of the New Youth Journal, emerged as early proponents of Marxism. They believed that China's salvation lay in the overthrow of the old order through a proletarian revolution. In 1920, with the assistance of the Comintern, the Communist International, headquartered in Moscow, Li and Chen began forming study groups to educate young intellectuals on Marxist principles. One of their students was Mao Zedong, a 27-year-old from Hunan province who worked as an assistant librarian at Peking University. Mao's exposure to Marxist literature, combined with his own observations of rural poverty, shaped his belief that peasants could play a revolutionary role. The birth of the Chinese Communist Party. By mid-1921, these Marxist study groups decided to unify into a formal organization. With guidance from the Comintern, the First National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party was convened in July 1921. It was held secretly in a brick-and-wood house in the French concession of Shanghai to avoid detection by the ruling authorities. 13 delegates attended, representing Marxist organizations from different parts of China. Among them were Chen Duxiu, Li Dazhao, Zhang Guitao, and Mao Zedong. Each represented a different segment of the nascent revolutionary movement. Despite being relatively unknown, Mao stood out for his grassroots organizing efforts in his home province of Hunan. The Congress deliberated on the creation of a Marxist-Leninist party tailored to China's unique conditions. They drafted a party constitution, outlined the party's mission to overthrow imperialism and feudalism, and pledged allegiance to the global communist movement. The delegates were fully aware of the dangers. The warlords controlled the countryside, while foreign authorities dominated the cities. During one session, their clandestine meeting was almost discovered by French authorities, forcing the delegates to hastily relocate to a tourist boat on Nanhu Lake in Zhejiang province to conclude their discussions. Mao Zedong's role in the CCP's early days. At the time of the Congress, Mao Zedong was not yet a central figure in the CCP. However, his experiences in rural Hunan gave him a unique perspective on China's revolutionary path. While many early CCP leaders focused on organizing urban workers, Mao argued that China's vast peasantry, nearly 90% of the population, was the true engine of revolution. After the Congress, Mao returned to Hunan, where he observed and documented the struggles of the rural poor. His landmark 1927 report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan would later influence the CCP's strategy of rural revolution and guerrilla warfare. Mao's work in Hunan coincided with efforts by other CCP leaders to build a base of support among urban workers. Strikes and labor movements were organized in major cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou. However, these efforts faced brutal repression from warlords and later from the Kuomintang, KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, who would betray the CCP in 1927, massacring thousands of communists in Shanghai. The Comintern's influence in the CCP-KMT alliance. From its inception, the CCP received support and guidance from the Comintern, which emphasized collaboration with the Kuomintang, KMT, to achieve national unification. This alliance, known as the First United Front, was formed in 1923. While the CCP initially operated as a small faction within the KMT, tensions simmered as ideological differences grew. Mao Zedong and other CCP leaders struggled to balance their revolutionary goals with the practical demands of the United Front. Despite these challenges, the CCP expanded its influence during this period, growing its membership and developing strategies for mass mobilization. The fragile beginnings of a movement. By the mid-1920s, the CCP was still a small party with fewer than 1,000 members, dwarfed by the KMT. However, the party's foundations had been laid. The intellectual rigor of figures like Chen Duxiu and Li Dajiao, combined with the grassroots organizing of leaders like Mao Zedong, set the stage for the CCP's evolution into a major political force. Mao's early emphasis on rural mobilization would later prove decisive. Over the next 2 decades, the CCP would grow from a scattered network of activists into a disciplined organization capable of challenging both the KMT and foreign imperialists. The dawn of a revolution. The founding of the CCP in 1921 was a modest yet momentous event. It represented the first organized attempt to apply Marxism to China's unique circumstances. Despite its small size and limited resources, the party's vision for a communist revolution captured the imagination of a generation of idealists determined to reshape their nation. For Mao Zedong, the journey from librarian's assistant to revolutionary leader was just beginning. His experiences during the CCP's formative years laid the groundwork for his later leadership, culminating in the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The story of the CCP's founding is one of perseverance and vision in the face of immense challenges, a reminder of how revolutionary movements often begin with small, determined groups seeking to change the world. Part 2. The Long March. In the autumn of 1934, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, faced a dire situation. After years of conflict with the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek, the Red Army found itself surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces in Jiangxi province. Faced with the imminent threat of destruction, the communist leadership made a historic decision. They would abandon their base and embark on a retreat that would become legendary in Chinese history known as the Long March. At the heart of the decision was the necessity of survival, not just for the Red Army, but for the future of the CCP itself. The retreat was not just a military maneuver but a strategic shift that would prove pivotal in the rise of Mao Zedong's leadership within the party. The Encirclement Campaign. The nationalist forces had launched what would become known as the Encirclement Campaign, designed to wipe out the CCP by cutting off their base in Jiangxi. The CCP's position was dire. Supplies were running low, morale was faltering, and the Red Army, which had once been a symbol of hope for the Chinese working class, was now on the verge of collapse. By October 1934, the Red Army was cornered. Outnumbered and outgunned, the communist leadership faced an impossible decision: fight to the death or retreat and risk losing everything. The answer was clear: retreat. But the challenge of retreat was enormous. The nationalist forces had blocked the main escape routes, and even the terrain itself seemed designed to destroy the retreating forces. The soldiers were physically exhausted, morale was low, and the harsh environment posed additional threats: rivers to cross, mountains to climb, and swamps to traverse. Mao Zedong's rising influence. At the time of the retreat, Mao Zedong was one of many leaders within the Communist Party, but it was during this time that his leadership would be solidified. Mao, a visionary strategist, had long believed in a new kind of warfare, one that relied not on conventional tactics, but on guerrilla warfare and deep knowledge of the local terrain. In the early stages of the retreat, the communist leadership was divided. Some of Mao's rivals, such as Zhou Enlai, initially disagreed with his vision for the retreat. However, it was during the harrowing months of the march that Mao's strategies began to demonstrate their effectiveness. His insistence on moving through unexpected routes, bypassing direct confrontations, and leveraging the support of the peasantry would come to define the way the CCP fought and ultimately survived. Mao's leadership became unquestioned as he successfully navigated the army through increasingly difficult circumstances. The brutality of the march. The Long March, spanning over 6,000 miles across China, was a grueling journey. The Red Army soldiers faced physical hardships that were unimaginable. The conditions were extreme: freezing cold in the mountains, blistering heat in the lowlands, and treacherous, swampy terrain that would claim the lives of many. The soldiers were often forced to march without adequate food or rest. At times, they subsisted on little more than tree bark and wild plants. Disease, exhaustion, and frostbite ravaged the troops, and countless men and women perished along the way. The most devastating loss came when the Red Army crossed the Xiang River. Nationalist forces had fortified the banks of the river, and crossing it proved to be a deadly endeavor. Thousands of soldiers drowned or were killed by artillery fire. It was during these dire moments that Mao Zedong's strategy of avoiding direct conflict was put to the test. The Red Army suffered immensely, but through sheer determination and ingenuity, they managed to survive and continue their march. The Junyi Conference was a turning point in leadership. One of the most crucial moments of the Long March came in early 1935, during the Junyi Conference. After months of hardship, the Red Army's survival had become a central concern. At this critical juncture, the CCP leadership convened to assess the retreat's course and the party's future. It was here, in Junyi, that Mao Zedong's leadership was solidified. Before this point, Mao had been one of several influential leaders, but the Junyi Conference changed everything. Mao's strategic thinking, his ability to adapt and innovate under pressure, and his emphasis on peasant support won the respect of many of the party's key figures. The failure of the previous leadership to protect the army during critical moments had led many to see Mao as the only leader capable of guiding the Red Army through its challenges. The decisions made at the Junyi Conference would ultimately lead to Mao taking control of the Communist Party's direction, marking the beginning of his political dominance. The harsh terrain and overcoming nature. Throughout the march, the soldiers faced a landscape that seemed intent on defeating them. The Red Army moved through the vast and treacherous mountain ranges of western China, navigating steep cliffs and snow-covered peaks. In the winter of 1935, the soldiers faced some of the harshest conditions, enduring extreme cold and low rations. Some soldiers, debilitated by frostbite, could no longer continue, while others succumbed to illness. Yet, despite the obstacles, the Red Army pressed forward. In the higher altitudes of Sichuan, the terrain turned from forests to barren, icy landscapes. It was here that many soldiers died, their bodies left in the snow as the rest of the army pressed on, driven by the hope of reaching safety. The legacy, the road to Yan'an. After a year of relentless marching, the Red Army reached the small town of Yan'an in October 1935, marking the end of the Long March. But the journey was not just about survival. It was about the transformation of the CCP. The party emerged from the march far stronger than it had been before. While fewer than 20,000 soldiers out of the original 85,000 survived, those who made it to Yan'an were battle-hardened and fiercely loyal to the communist cause. More importantly, it was in Yan'an that the seeds of the Chinese Revolution were sown. The Long March had not only ensured the survival of the CCP, but had also solidified Mao Zedong's leadership. Over the next decade, the Communist Party would continue to grow, eventually leading to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Mao's philosophy, forged in the fires of the Long March, would dominate Chinese politics for decades to come. The march became a symbol of the Chinese Communist Party's resilience, the enduring strength of its ideology, and the determination of its people. The Long March remains one of the most iconic and defining episodes in modern Chinese history. It was a journey fraught with peril, yet it was also a journey of transformation, both for the individuals who endured it and for the future of China itself. The survival of the Red Army and the rise of Mao Zedong as its leader would go on to reshape the course of Chinese history forever. The Long March was not just a military retreat. It was a testament to the power of ideology, perseverance, and leadership in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Part 3. The Chinese Civil War, a pivotal conflict in 20th-century Chinese history, provides a fascinating, complex backdrop that defines the modern political landscape of China. At its core, the war was fought between two powerful factions, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, led by Mao Zedong, and the Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, KMT, headed by Chiang Kai-shek. This war did not emerge in isolation. It was influenced by a series of historical, social, and international factors that would propel China into an entirely new era. To understand the Civil War's intensity after World War II and the CCP's eventual victory, we must first trace the political and military developments of the preceding decades, starting from the early 20th century. The early years, nationalism versus communism. The seeds of the Chinese Civil War were planted as early as 1911 with the fall of the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for over 200 years. The collapse of the imperial system created a vacuum of power, leading to the rise of various warlords, regional military leaders, and political factions across the country. Amid this political fragmentation, the KMT, led by Sun Yat-sen, emerged as the dominant nationalist party advocating for a republican China. The KMT aimed to modernize China, free it from foreign influence, and establish a unified nation-state. Meanwhile, the rise of communism in China took root in the 1920s. The Chinese Communist Party was established in 1921, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in Russia. Mao Zedong, a key figure within the CCP, would rise to prominence as a leading proponent of peasant-based revolutionary strategies. Though the early years of the CCP were marked by sporadic revolts and marginal influence, it was during the 1920s and 1930s that both parties would solidify their positions, resulting in initial clashes. The struggle for power. The First United Front, 1924 to 1927. The KMT and CCP initially found common cause in fighting foreign imperialism and warlordism. In 1924, the two parties formed a temporary alliance known as the First United Front, intending to modernize and unify China. However, this alliance was short-lived, as ideological differences and power struggles within the KMT soon led to the breakdown of cooperation. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the KMT, launched a violent purge against the communists, marking the beginning of a full-scale civil war. This period of tension, known as the White Terror, saw many communists executed or forced into hiding, and Mao Zedong retreated to rural areas to rebuild the CCP's power base. The war with Japan and the resumption of the Civil War. While both the CCP and KMT were embroiled in their conflict, the 1930s saw a new external threat, Japan's invasion of China. The Japanese military sought to expand its empire across East Asia, and in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, culminating in the infamous rape of Nanking and widespread destruction. This invasion temporarily halted the Civil War as both the KMT and CCP realized the existential threat posed by Japanese imperialism. In 1937, the two parties formed a second, more fragile united front to resist Japan, but tensions remained beneath the surface. During this period, the KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, remained the recognized government of China and received significant military aid from the United States. The CCP, meanwhile, took advantage of the Japanese occupation of large swathes of China to expand its influence, particularly in rural areas. Mao Zedong and his forces engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Japanese, building support among peasants and positioning the communists as a major force in Chinese politics. By the time Japan's defeat in 1945 ended the Second World War, the CCP had significantly strengthened its position. The KMT, meanwhile, was weakened by corruption, internal divisions, and its inability to prevent Japanese occupation in large parts of the country. Post-World War II, the resumption of civil war. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, the civil war between the CCP and KMT quickly resumed. The political and military landscape had dramatically shifted. The KMT had been unable to rebuild its authority in many regions, while the CCP had successfully expanded its control, especially in rural areas. The United States, which had been allied with the KMT during the war, continued to provide Chiang Kai-shek with substantial financial and military aid, while the Soviet Union, despite their ideological differences with the CCP, began to offer indirect support to the communists. One key reason for the CCP's success during this period was its strategic emphasis on the peasantry. Mao Zedong, ever the strategist, understood that China's vast rural population held the key to victory. While the KMT remained largely focused on the urban elite and military power, the CCP implemented policies aimed at addressing the needs and grievances of the peasantry, such as land reform and promises of social equality. This approach won the CCP widespread support among rural Chinese, which made up the vast majority of the population. The CCP's victory and why the KMT lost? The ultimate victory of the CCP in 1949 and the subsequent establishment of the People's Republic of China can be attributed to several factors. Weakness of the KMT government. Despite receiving support from the United States, the KMT government was deeply corrupt and ineffective. The KMT was also burdened by its inability to deal with the socio-economic conditions of China. While the CCP offered promises of land redistribution and an end to the oppression of the rural population, the KMT remained more concerned with consolidating power among the urban elite, which alienated much of the Chinese populace. The strength of the CCP's guerrilla warfare strategy. The CCP's military tactics were heavily influenced by Mao's theory of protracted warfare, which focused on using the support of the people and fighting a war of attrition. Throughout the war, the CCP was able to effectively engage in guerrilla warfare, while the KMT's military strategies were less flexible and more conventional, which ultimately led to significant losses. Soviet support. The Soviet Union, though not directly intervening in the Civil War, played an indirect role in the CCP's victory. After Japan's defeat, Soviet forces in Manchuria captured a large cache of Japanese weapons, which they then handed over to the CCP. This gave the Communists a substantial military advantage over the KMT, who lacked the resources to fight effectively. Economic and moral collapse of the KMT. The KMT faced a deteriorating economic situation, with inflation spiraling out of control and widespread poverty. The CCP, on the other hand, positioned itself as a champion of the common people, promising land reform and an end to the corruption that plagued the KMT. The KMT's inability to resolve these issues further eroded public support. The collapse of KMT morale. As the CCP steadily gained ground, KMT morale began to falter. Many KMT soldiers and officials defected to the communist side, further diminishing the effectiveness of the nationalist forces. The aftermath and the rise of the People's Republic of China. By October 1, 1949, after years of intense fighting and political maneuvering, the CCP had emerged victorious. Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, with the KMT retreating to the island of Taiwan, where it established a government in exile. The victory marked the culmination of years of struggle, ideological commitment, and strategic genius on the part of the CCP leadership. The establishment of the PRC would set China on a path of rapid social, economic, and political transformation, ushering in an era of communist rule that would last for decades. The KMT, meanwhile, continued to hold Taiwan, where it maintained a separate government for several more decades. The Civil War left a deep and lasting impact on both the Chinese mainland and Taiwan, and the legacy of the conflict continues to shape cross-strait relations today. The Chinese Civil War was a conflict rooted in deep ideological, social, and political divides, shaped by both domestic and international forces. The CCP's victory was not inevitable, but it was the result of a combination of factors: strategic brilliance, the ability to tap into popular discontent, the military advantage gained from Soviet support, and the ultimate failure of the KMT to govern effectively. In the aftermath, China was reshaped into the world's most populous communist state, and the KMT's retreat to Taiwan ensured that the political and military struggle would remain unresolved for many years to come. This period in history serves as a testament to the power of revolutionary movements, the complexity of civil wars, and how external factors and domestic issues intertwine to influence the outcome of such a defining struggle. The civil war between the CCP and KMT not only determined the political fate of China, but also reshaped the global balance of power in the post-World War II world. Part 4. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, from the rostrum of Tiananmen Square in Beijing. This momentous event marked not only the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War, but also the culmination of over a century of political and social turmoil that had engulfed the nation. To truly understand the significance of this proclamation, it's important to delve into the historical background leading up to this day, the revolutionary movements that shaped it, and the subsequent impact on China and the world. The historical context. The history of modern China is one of persistent upheaval and transformation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, China was seen as a fading imperial power, caught in the grips of internal corruption and external pressure. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for over 250 years, was unable to modernize in the face of Western imperialism and Japan's growing power. This led to a series of humiliating defeats in the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, resulting in the cession of territory to foreign powers and the imposition of unequal treaties. The Qing dynasty's inability to defend China's sovereignty led to the 1911 revolution, which overthrew the imperial system and established the Republic of China. However, the republic struggled from the outset, plagued by warlordism, regionalism, and factionalism. The new government, under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek, faced numerous challenges, including the constant threat of foreign influence and invasion, as well as internal strife. Meanwhile, on the political left, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, was emerging as a force. Founded in 1921 with the support of the Soviet Union, the CCP initially focused on spreading Marxist ideology and challenging the nationalist government led by the Kuomintang, KMT. Early CCP efforts to build a mass movement were crushed by the KMT, leading to the infamous Long March from 1934 to 1935, where the Communists, under Mao Zedong's leadership, endured immense hardship in their retreat to northern China. This is where Mao solidified his leadership and began developing his own interpretation of Marxism, which would later become known as Maoism. The Japanese invasion and the Second United Front. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 dramatically altered the political landscape. The invasion by Japan unified the KMT and the CCP in a temporary alliance known as the Second United Front. While the KMT was the primary force fighting the Japanese, the CCP used this period to expand its influence in rural areas, build support among peasants, and establish guerrilla warfare tactics against the Japanese occupation. This period also marked the CCP's increasing appeal to the masses, particularly in rural China, as it promised land reform and a more equitable distribution of resources. The KMT, in contrast, faced growing corruption, inefficiency, and a failure to address the needs of the Chinese people. While the KMT leadership led the fight against the Japanese, it lost the support of many ordinary Chinese who were disillusioned with its inability to address domestic problems. By the end of World War II in 1945, Japan had been defeated, but China was left politically divided. The nationalists and communists, while having fought a common enemy, soon found themselves at odds again, leading to the resumption of the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War, which had been intermittently fought since the 1920s, escalated after World War II. After the defeat of Japan, the CCP and the KMT renewed their struggle for control of China. The war was marked by several key factors. The KMT's weakness. Despite being recognized as the legitimate government of China by the Allies, the nationalists faced internal corruption, economic mismanagement, and the exhaustion of their resources after the war with Japan. The KMT's inability to modernize and address the economic needs of the people led to a loss of popular support. The CCP's strength. Under Mao's leadership, the CCP was able to effectively mobilize peasants, wage guerrilla warfare, and build a solid base of support. The Communists focused on winning the hearts and minds of the rural population by promising land reforms and social justice, which was a sharp contrast to the KMT's focus on urban elites. Foreign influence. The United States provided significant military and financial support to the KMT, while the Soviet Union offered aid to the CCP, particularly in the form of military equipment and training. However, the U.S. support was not enough to turn the tide in favor of Chiang Kai-shek, especially as his government's legitimacy continued to erode. By 1947, the KMT was in retreat. The CCP had gained control of large swathes of rural China, and Mao's forces, now well organized and experienced, were able to win significant battles. With the fall of key cities like Manchuria and the encroachment of CCP forces on the KMT's stronghold in southern China, the nationalist government became increasingly untenable. Mao's proclamation and the birth of the PRC. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood before a crowd of thousands in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The declaration was made after years of intense struggle, both militarily and ideologically. The moment signified the final victory of the Communist Party over the nationalists and the beginning of a new era in Chinese history. The significance of Mao's proclamation goes beyond the end of a civil war. It marked the end of a century of foreign domination, internal chaos, and the long struggle for Chinese sovereignty. Mao promised to liberate China from imperialism, feudalism, and corruption, and the new government was seen as a beacon of hope for the Chinese people who had suffered for so long under warlords, foreign invaders, and the inefficiency of the nationalist government. The establishment of the PRC also marked the beginning of a new ideological era. Mao's vision of a communist society, with a focus on Marxist-Leninist principles combined with his own ideological thoughts, Maoism, would shape Chinese politics for the next several decades. The emphasis on class struggle, agrarian reform, and the collectivization of land and industry would profoundly alter China's political, economic, and social fabric. The early years of the People's Republic. The early years of the PRC were focused on consolidating power, implementing land reforms, and rebuilding the war-torn country. One of the first major acts of the new government was the redistribution of land to peasants, fulfilling Mao's promises of land reform. This measure won the loyalty of millions of peasants, but it also created tensions with landlords and others who had previously benefited from the old system. In 1950, China also entered the Korean War in support of North Korea, a decision that would shape China's foreign policy for years to come and solidify its alliance with the Soviet Union. Domestically, the CCP began to suppress political dissent, and the period saw the consolidation of power by the Communist Party, including the execution or imprisonment of political rivals. The coming decades would be marked by radical economic policies such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which, while aiming to modernize China, led to widespread suffering, famine, and political persecution. However, despite the economic and social upheavals, the PRC under Mao remained a significant force in both Asian and global geopolitics, emerging as a key player in the Cold War. The impact and legacy. The proclamation of the PRC in 1949 not only changed China but also had a profound impact on the world stage. China's rise as a communist superpower, with its enormous population and growing military might, presented a challenge to Western powers, particularly the United States. The PRC's influence spread across Asia, leading to the establishment of communist regimes in neighboring countries and becoming a key player in the Cold War. Domestically, the formation of the PRC laid the groundwork for a new China, though the path to modernity would be fraught with obstacles. While the country experienced periods of significant growth and industrialization, the political and social policies of Mao's leadership created periods of immense turmoil and suffering. Yet, despite these struggles, China would eventually emerge as a global economic powerhouse in the decades after Mao died in 1976, particularly after reforms under Deng Xiaoping in the late 20th century. In summary, Mao Zedong's proclamation of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, marked a pivotal moment in Chinese history. It represented the end of centuries of dynastic rule, foreign domination, and internal strife. It was a victory for the Chinese Communist Party, but also the beginning of a new chapter of social, economic, and political upheaval. The legacy of that day, and the decades that followed, continues to shape China's place in the world today. Part 5. Mao Zedong's leadership in China during the mid-20th century is one of the most complex and controversial periods in modern history. His policies, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, resulted in widespread upheaval, suffering, and death for millions of Chinese citizens. This commentary will delve into the consequences of Mao's actions, his internal and external struggles for power, and how these events reshaped modern China. Mao's early leadership and ideological roots. Mao Zedong, as a founding figure of the People's Republic of China, was initially seen by many as a revolutionary hero. His leadership in the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, helped lead the country to victory over the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. His ideological inspiration came largely from Marxism-Leninism, but Mao adapted these ideas to fit China's unique social, economic, and political conditions. His brand of communism, often referred to as Maoism, emphasized the role of the peasantry in revolution, something that distinguished his ideology from Soviet-style communism, which focused more on the urban proletariat. However, once in power, Mao's ambitious policies began to deviate from pragmatic governance to a more paranoid and authoritarian approach, driven in part by his belief that revolutionary zeal was needed to maintain a continuous momentum towards socialism and that his authority needed to be solidified at all costs. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962. One of Mao's most disastrous policies was the Great Leap Forward, initiated in 1958. The goal of this policy was to rapidly industrialize China and transform its largely agrarian society into a modern, socialist economy. Mao sought to achieve this through collectivization and the creation of large communes. Farmers were forced to abandon private farming, and the land was collectivized into vast communes that were supposed to increase agricultural output. Additionally, Mao pushed for backyard steel furnaces, where peasants were encouraged to smelt metal into crude iron to boost industrial production. However, the policy was fundamentally flawed. The government's efforts to impose collectivization and central planning on agriculture were a disaster. With peasants uprooted from their traditional land-based livelihood, the production of food drastically fell. The communes often operated inefficiently, and workers were poorly equipped and uninformed. The infamous backyard furnaces also resulted in the production of low-quality metal, which was useless for industrial purposes. The most catastrophic result of the Great Leap Forward was the famine it triggered. Between 15 and 45 million people died due to hunger, malnutrition, and starvation, making it one of the deadliest man-made disasters in human history. The famine was exacerbated by a lack of communication between local leaders and the central government, where inflated reports of agricultural success were often sent up the chain. Many officials feared contradicting Mao's policies, so the truth about the extent of the disaster was hidden. Mao's stubbornness and refusal to admit failure during this period only intensified the suffering. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the Great Leap Forward was a failure, Mao's position in the CCP remained largely unchallenged at this point, although cracks were starting to appear in his leadership. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Following the disastrous consequences of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's leadership began to lose some of its luster within the Chinese Communist Party. To reassert his authority and to eliminate his rivals, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This movement, ostensibly aimed at preserving Chinese communism and purging capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society, was far more radical and violent in practice. The Cultural Revolution was driven by Mao's paranoia about opposition to his leadership, particularly within the CCP. He saw intellectuals, government officials, and even ordinary citizens as potential threats to his power. To remove these perceived enemies, Mao mobilized the Red Guards, a movement made up mostly of young students who were encouraged to rebel against authority figures, including teachers, government officials, and even their own families. The Red Guards began to carry out violent campaigns to root out supposed counter-revolutionaries, and in the process, they destroyed cultural heritage, including temples, books, and artworks. During the Cultural Revolution, millions of people were persecuted, publicly humiliated, imprisoned, or killed. Intellectuals and perceived counter-revolutionaries were targeted, and many of them were tortured or sent to labor camps for re-education. It is estimated that between 1 and 2 million people died during this period of purges, and many others were affected by the trauma of this movement. Mao's paranoia was not limited to intellectuals and officials. He turned against former allies within the Communist Party, particularly those who had gained influence during the years after the Great Leap Forward. This created an atmosphere of fear and distrust, where anyone could be accused of being a traitor or enemy of the revolution. The result was a breakdown of social order and a stagnation of the country's development, as intellectuals and professionals were removed from their positions, leaving behind a vacuum of leadership and expertise. Mao's grip on power during the Cultural Revolution was further solidified by his use of mass mobilization. By involving the youth, especially the Red Guards, in revolutionary actions, Mao kept the momentum of his ideology alive, using them as foot soldiers to maintain his vision of a purged China. However, the Cultural Revolution ultimately spiraled out of control. Violence escalated, social and economic systems broke down, and the leadership of the Communist Party was left in disarray. Mao's paranoia and leadership style. Mao's policies were driven by a deep paranoia about potential threats to his authority. His leadership style was authoritarian, and he relied heavily on ideological purity to maintain control. As the founder of the CCP and the People's Republic of China, Mao felt an immense personal responsibility for the success of the revolution. He believed that continuous revolution was necessary to prevent China from slipping back into capitalist or feudal states, but this belief also led him to embrace extreme measures to achieve his vision. Mao was acutely aware of his power and the need to assert dominance over all aspects of Chinese life. To control the narrative, he cultivated a personality cult, portraying himself as the infallible leader whose wisdom could never be questioned. This led to a situation where even when evidence showed that his policies were failing, there was a refusal to acknowledge mistakes. The results of Mao's paranoia were devastating for China. In addition to the millions of lives lost through direct violence or famine, the social fabric of China was deeply scarred. Families were torn apart, communities were fractured, and trust in institutions was severely eroded. Impact on modern China. Mao's reign left an indelible mark on modern China. The policies he enacted, particularly the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, were deeply traumatic for the Chinese people. The years of upheaval resulted in a generation that lived through violence, famine, and societal collapse. The effects of Mao's leadership reverberated through the generations that followed, affecting the development of the economy, culture, and politics. Following Mao's death in 1976, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, began a series of reforms aimed at modernizing China's economy and opening the country to the outside world. While Deng's reforms marked a departure from the strict policies of the past, they did not completely undo the damage caused by Mao's rule. The economic transformation of China under Deng lifted millions out of poverty, but the country's political system remained under the control of the Communist Party, now with a more pragmatic focus on economic development rather than ideological purity. Today, Mao is still revered by some as the founding father of modern China, but his legacy is also the subject of great debate. Many acknowledge his role in unifying China, but they also recognize the suffering and devastation caused by his policies. Modern Chinese leadership has worked to distance itself from the more extreme aspects of Maoism, but his influence remains deeply embedded in the country's history and identity. Conclusion. Mao Zedong's policies, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, shaped modern China in profound ways, though often in tragic and destructive terms. The millions of lives lost, the widespread suffering, and the societal upheaval created by Mao's paranoia and authoritarian rule highlight the dangers of unchecked power. Mao's ambition to create a new China was tempered by his willingness to sacrifice human lives in the name of ideology, and the legacy of this period continues to affect Chinese society today. Mao's actions reveal the perils of authoritarian leadership and the consequences of radical ideologies when they are pursued without regard for human suffering. While modern China has undergone remarkable economic changes, the shadows of Mao's reign still loom large over its history. The lessons of this period serve as a cautionary tale for future generations about the importance of leadership that is guided by reason, humility, and respect for human dignity. If you've enjoyed this video, please check out future videos on my channel. Please like, comment, and consider subscribing to CyberTheo.